So you're joining us today for the Clements Bookworm, and we're really happy to have you for our second episode. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. It looks like most people have figured out how to chat. So thanks so much. Please continue to chime in. The conversation goes by very quickly, as you can see. So if you have a specific question along the way, please use the Q&A section. You can ask your questions there and they won't disappear. You can upvote other people's questions, and then you'll be able to see the answers posted right there with the question. This is organized by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements collects, preserves, and makes available historical resources about the Americas with particular strengths in the 18th and 19th century early American history. Today's topic is women and the right to vote. So you'll have a chance to meet our three panelists today, Jayne, Estrella, and Chrisitina, and they'll be sharing some selections around this topic. So after the stay-at-home order was issued, the Clements staff brainstormed ways to stay connected with everyone. And we were particularly inspired by Clements Tea Time. We love how the conversation becomes very organic at that time. So if you don't know, Clements Tea Time is every day at 10 o'clock, a bell is rung and researchers are invited to head to the Avenir Foundation room, to leave the Avenir Foundation room and head to the tea room where they can enjoy a cup of coffee or tea and visit with each other about their current work. So our first panelist is Jayne Ptolemy. She's Assistant Director of Manuscripts at the Clements Library and a frequent participant around the Clements tea table. Jayne, what do you particularly enjoy about tea time?
Well, I think tea time really exemplifies what makes the Clements a special place to work and research. Tea time is kind of like a space to pause at the beginning of the day and kind of check in with each other. You can talk about what you're working on, sources you're hoping to find, what you're reading, what you watched. It's like a really beautiful moment to just kind of connect together, either as staff and with researchers. I think it really shows that we see ourselves as collaborators with people in the reading room, that we value that time to connect and share. And it kind of, I think, shows that we all abide by the ethos that we work better when we work together. And plus, it's just nice to get an extra cup of coffee in the morning to get your engine going.
Thank you. Real quick, I just want to end our first poll about the bookmarks, and it looks like the actual paper bookmark has indeed taken the lead. And I would like to start a poll about tea time. We'd love to hear if you've participated in tea time before, and of course, what your beverage and snack of choice are. So you can take a moment to do that. And I'm happy that Jayne will be talking about a book today, Why They Marched. And Jayne, tell us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so let me just first start by saying I've been hearing a lot about the ways that people are keeping themselves busy during quarantine, you know, baking bread and cleaning closets and reading lots of books. I'm going to be really honest and say that between working from home with a 3-year-old who you might see at some point, panic reading the news and wiping down all my doorknobs multiple times a day, at the end of the day, I really don't have much bandwidth to do much beyond fall into bed and try to sleep. So for those of you who might be similarly exhausted and distracted at this time, a good option to pick up is Susan Ware's Why They Marched, Untold Stories of the Women Who Fought for the Right to Vote. It came out just last year in time for the centennial of the 19th Amendment, And it's also really easily digestible. Ware, she's a historian and a feminist biographer, breaks the book into 19 discrete chapters that really stand alone in some ways, but speak to each other if you're reading it as a whole. Each chapter is a mini biographical study that she pairs with a really smart object analysis to ground each story with the material culture that surrounded the political organizing. Really interesting concept. Ware also deliberately moves away from the big hitters that most of us are aware of beyond one short chapter about Susan B. Anthony. Otherwise, she's mainly highlighting lesser known names. This approach allows for kind of a really interesting, diverse array of figures that some you might have vaguely heard of, but most you probably haven't. I know a lot of it was brand new territory for me, which made it really exciting to read. It also gives her the opportunity to then highlight and select moments that reflect on the suffrage movement's struggles with racism, xenophobia, economic privilege, and it lets her move beyond the typical East Coast narrative. So in this book, you'll find stories about the interplay between polygamy and suffrage in Utah, female mountain climbers who planted votes for women flags on Mount Rainier, African-American activists' refusals to abide by segregated processions. You'll see figures ranging from labor activists, novelists, political cartoonists, and lobbyists in the halls of Congress. My personal favorite chapter was the story of Claiborne Caitlin, who toured Massachusetts on horseback for 4 months in 1914 with no money, just what she could pack in a small saddlebag and relying on the kindness of strangers. So these types of chapters really come together to create a compelling montage of stories. And it gives a real beautiful sense of the varied ways that all kinds of women were roused to be involved in the movement. Women's suffrage, Ware is reminding us, came to fruition not only because of the movement's lauded leaders that we hear about all the time, but also because of the women who did the work on the ground too, and that work came about in all different forms. I'm going to admit that I never really got a good education about women's suffrage. It always was kind of glossed over in all of my history classes. So I always have felt a little alienated from that story. I don't feel like I will ever be a Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton. If you look behind me, you'll probably see a pile of laundry on my dryer that will never get put away. I'm probably not going to be leading any, social reform movement. I can barely remember to brush my hair these days. But reading Ware's book, I finally got a glimpse that if I had lived in that era, there probably would have been a way for me to get involved because there was so much work going on in so many different ways on so many different levels that women could find a way to get involved if they felt so inspired. There are limitations to the book. The 19 biographies don't really give you a great overview of the movement as a whole. So I never really felt lost, but there were certainly moments where she's talking about something that I wasn't entirely sure where it fit into this bigger narrative. So it's maybe not an introductory text, but I think it would still work really well in the classroom. I would love to see this paired with kind of like a more formal history or more of a timeline and trying to think through how these stories interact with that bigger narrative. It's really easy to read one chapter. They're really compelling stories that I think students would really enjoy reading. Ware's tale is also predominantly one of the early 20th century. And while she tips her hat to the work women did before Seneca Falls and after the passage of the 19th Amendment, it still kind of felt to me like there was a missed opportunity to not include full chapters about earlier and later women to really challenge that kind of traditional timeline. And as much as the book makes the case that there's a need to tell wider narratives about women in the suffrage movement, and that she's trying to encompass the rank and file and not just the celebrities, it's still kind of read like a story about leaders and heroes. Maybe not the biggest and most public names, but still leaders. For example, in the chapter about Catlin's horseback tour, which I loved, it's really great, we get these small glimpses of the families that gave Catlin a place to sleep, that fed her, that gave her extra oats for her horses. And there's even one powerful moment where Catlin was turned away by a domineering husband, like really rudely. She didn't know where she was going to stay for the night. And the wife whispers to her as she's leaving, God bless you for trying to help the women. I want to know more about those women and their stories and how they connected to the suffrage movement. And while technically this is a criticism of some of the limitations of the book, I also think it's kind of a compliment, because the best histories compel us to keep asking questions and to look for our own answers. And I know as soon as the library reopens, I'm going to be in there trying to find that. So in closing, Susan Ware's Why They Marched, Untold Stories of the Women Who Fought for the Right to Vote is a really great read. You can easily finish a chapter in one sitting, even with a 3-year-old trying to sit on your lap. It's perfect for my stress-riddled attention span right now. And it's really chock full of great stories that are poignant, funny, quirky, and inspiring. It's a great reminder that change happens on the ground in all different kinds of ways and all different kinds of capacities. So maybe there is work that we can accomplish now on our own smaller scales when we find the energy to do it.
Thank you, Jayne. I'm looking in the Q&A section and I do see a couple of questions. John Bullington is wondering what the lady's name is that rode her horse around in Massachusetts.
Claiborne Catlin.
All right, thank you. And Valerie Marvin is wondering if there are any stories about Midwestern women. So many suffrage histories tend to focus on the East Coast stories.
Oh, there's one about farmers. There was an interesting farming story, but I don't remember where it was. This book really does challenge the East Coast narrative. Like there's Utah, there's Washington, like Washington State. She talked a little bit about international connections as well. So I don't remember off the top of my head if there is a Midwest component, but this is definitely a great read if you're trying to think through like beyond New York, Philadelphia, Boston, how does this play out on the ground? I think you'll definitely find some stories here that will speak to you.
Great, thank you. And maybe after you're done, you can just double check the Q&A and see if there's anything else that needs answering. But I know you and I had talked a little bit about some of the materials that people can find at the Clements Library related to women and the right to vote.
Yeah, so our collection scope, formal suffrage is a little late for us. So our sources tend to be much stronger for the generations of women preceding the 19th Amendment. We have rich sources documenting women's experiences earlier. So I'm thinking, the Grimke family papers are really great for showing the interplay between abolition and women's rights, which is really important. But personally, I really love our sources relating to bloomerism. They're really great. This is shown on the screen here. This is a print from 1851, Bloomerism in Practice. And what's really interesting to me is how it seems to kind of echo a lot of the anti-suffrage stuff that you'll see. You have women in bloomers out in the public. That's the wife there with her hand on her husband's head who's mending his own coat. The child's abandoned in the foreground, all sad and crying. And the same kinds of things that you're going to see when women are calling for the right to vote are echoed here from 1851. So those kind of interesting parallels between whenever women are trying to challenge and enter the public sphere, those same types of arguments are coming forth. And if you're looking for some musical accompaniment, we have some really great illustrated sheet music from the same time period about bloomers. So it's a nice way to see how all of our different divisions kind of come together to give you these interesting glimpses about American culture and history and women's kind of the iterations of women's entrances into the public sphere. You're going to find a lot of stuff from the earlier generations.
Thank you, Jayne. Thanks so much. Thanks for sharing about this.
Sure.
All right. So next up, I would like to introduce Estrella Salgado, a U of M student and a member of the Clements Library Development and Communications Committee. Welcome, Estrella. What are you sharing today?
So I recently reread The Woman's Hour by Elaine Weiss. She's a journalist from the Baltimore area, and her previous book was about women in World War I. This book, The Woman's Hour, was absolutely incredible. I had read it a couple of years ago, and I just found so much even more information when I reread it now. It's also been optioned into a TV series produced by Hillary Clinton and Steven Spielberg, so real power couple there. Definitely keep an eye out for it. And so the Woman's Hour focuses on Nashville, August 1920, just before the 19th Amendment, spoiler alert, is going to be ratified. And so they needed 36 out of the current 48 states to ratify. And Tennessee was considered to be the last hope, the one that could really get it through. But of course, there were a lot of forces that did not approve of women's suffrage. And so the book focuses on the anti-suffragists, known as the antis, and the suffragettes, known as the suffs. And so the antis in many ways are who you would expect, corporations. So the liquor corporations. Now you might think 1920, isn't this prohibition? Prohibition didn't really work necessarily, and the liquor corporations definitely still had some sway. And so there was actually in the Hermitage Hotel, which is still around, that was the headquarters for all the antis and the suffs. They had a floor in which they would basically serve a lot of Jack Daniels and tell politicians to, oh, come round, you can have some whiskey, and then we'll tell you about why you shouldn't vote for women's suffrage. And so this discussion of the liquor industry is really important for women, especially because Amelia Bloomer was mentioned over in Jayne's discussion just now, and she had a newspaper called The Lily, which was about suffrage, but also about temperance. Those of you who read the Washington Post might realize that The Lily is their current millennial women's section. That's where it gets the name from. So this topic about alcohol is a really big concern if women begin to vote. There's also concerns from labor, textile, railroads that are concerned that women are going to start cutting back on child labor laws and things like that. And so you have those kind of expected figures. But I really like that she talks about the women who didn't want suffrage. And to me, the first time that I learned about that, it seemed crazy. Like, why would you not want suffrage to the degree in which you were actively campaigning against it? So these women, their symbol was a red rose as opposed to the suffragettes' yellow roses. And one woman was Josephine Pearson. Now, she taught history and philosophy. She was a very well-educated woman. However, she thought that suffrage was an assault on states' rights, a little phrase that we hear quite often in US history. And so there were women who weren't thinking about states' rights necessarily, but were more about the separate spheres. This is a separate book, but it's called All American Girl. I definitely recommend this book if people are interested in about this sphere of domesticity. Basically thinking that women should not be involved in politics whatsoever. Jayne showed a really great cartoon of how it would be a disaster if women were to start voting. Here there's a cartoon, America when feminized, and there's a chicken, and the chicken is abandoning her eggs. There was really a fear that women were going to abandon the household. And it does bring up a concern of if women, leave the household, who's going to do the housework, things like that. And some women were so concerned about this that it was enough for them to be anti-suffragettes. Now, for the famous suffragettes, she mainly focuses not on more obscure characters, but on the classic, Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, who in many ways did not get along. Carrie Chapman Catt was Susan B. Anthony's protege, and she was very mainstream, whereas Alice Paul was more inspired by the British, more radical Emmeline Pankhurst with her deeds, not words. And so they did have some clashes, which was really interesting to read about because it's so important to remember that women are not just one unit of thought. Women are not one voting block. They all want the same thing. There are divisions. One of my favorite women to read about was Sue Shelton White. She was someone who I had not heard about before. Now she was on Alice Paul's team, and she was from Tennessee, which really helped because it made the movement seem a little bit more accessible to those who were in Tennessee. It's been spoken of today about how so many times suffragette narratives tend to focus on the East Coast, and that is true. In Tennessee, they felt like, oh, this is just something that's from the East Coast. It's not something that's from us. And so advocacy from Tennessee women was a really huge part of getting this to be ratified. And so the book, of course, has the wonderful 19th Amendment goes through. But what I really like about it is that it also focuses on what happens after that. So there was an election that year, and only about 1/3 of eligible women voted. And so you'd think, well, this must have been a huge blow to the women who were suffragettes and did all this fighting for so many years, and really 70 years since Seneca Falls. But Carrie Chapman Catt talked about how voting is a learned practice. And so just because women have the right to vote doesn't mean that they know who to vote for, how to vote. And of course, you have to consider that there were, like Jayne said, husbands that were not going to let their wives vote, that were not going to let them have a political voice. And so it's still an issue that we see today with voter turnout. And so I really like how Elaine Weiss makes sure to kind of really ground that narrative in what is the actual practical impact of all this wonderful theoretical thought that's going on.
Thank you, Estrella. I was wondering if there are aspects that you relate to that you can connect to personally.
For personally, I think that definitely was the women like Sue Shelton White that I really connected with, because someone like Carrie Chapman Catt, she's such a huge figure. It's really hard to find some kind of middle ground with her to really relate to her. But reading about how these younger women who were going to go to college and who had all these great ideas were being inspired, it was really wonderful to read about. Sue Shelton White later went on to go to college, I believe maybe it was law school, and then she also actually ended up working for the Social Security Administration. And so seeing how these young women were really finding their voice is really exciting, especially as a college student who's currently absorbing all this political thought and thinking about what I want to do for that in the future.
Thank you. I also was wondering if you had an opportunity to take advantage of any of the events on campus before we all had to stay at home. I know that there were a lot of events around the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment.
Yes, I did go to a wonderful one. I'm looking it up now. It was a panel called 100 Years of Women Voting, the 19th Amendment's Legacy and Current Implications, through the Poli-Sci Department. And it was really cool because it discussed, one of the topics was why women oppose policies that support women, which fit along perfectly with this narrative of anti-suffragettes that Elaine Weiss was putting out. And so I think it's just so amazing when people go through these histories again and see how it really reflects on today's current politics. There are a lot of policies that could be argued support women, yet there are women who are actively campaigning against them. So you have to wonder why this happened and realize women are not one unified voting bloc. There were Democrats who opposed suffrage, there were Republicans who opposed suffrage. So not putting women into one small box and thinking, yeah, you all support this is so important.
All right, thank you so much for sharing. That was really great. Next up, we have Christina Karras, who is a member of the Clements Library Development and Communications Committee. Christina and I, along with Clements Librarian Emerita Arlene Shai, had the opportunity to volunteer for the Votes for Women 100, organized by the League of Women Voters to help commemorate the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. We created a timeline for the website that we can share with all of you, and during that process, read a lot of books and articles. So Christina, what articles will you be talking about today?
Thanks, Angela. Today, I will be talking about The Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill, which was published in 1869, and The Enfranchisement of Women by Harriet Taylor Mill, who later became his wife, which appeared in the Westminster and Foreign Review, Quarterly Review for July 1851. So I wanted to take us back a little ways to a text that was straight out of the period and contemporaneous with the earlier women's suffrage movement in both the British movement, but also I wanted to speak a little bit about how this text strongly influenced the American suffrage movement. So why did I choose these texts? Well, John Stuart Mill is often considered one of the most important, significant philosophers of, well, British philosophers of the 19th century. But if you're like me and you had always read Mill in the context of philosophy and political economy, with his famous text on liberty and utilitarianism, you might have been surprised, you might be surprised to know, as I was, that he was actually heavily involved in the movement of rights for women, including women's suffrage, and was actually quite a thinker on the forefront of these topics, which can partly be attributed to his association with Harriet Taylor, later Harriet Taylor Mill, once they married. So actually, as a member of Parliament, Mill introduced he brought forth to Parliament the first serious parliamentary petition to grant elective franchise to all women who own property. It was drafted by his stepdaughter, Helen Taylor, who was Harriet Taylor Mill's daughter from her previous marriage. This was on behalf of the Kensington Society, which was a group of educated women in the London area, I believe, who met routinely as a discussion group to sort of continue the higher education that they were denied to get in practice. And they gathered about 1,500 signatures to this petition from women all over the UK and Ireland. And Mill agreed to bring it forth to the House of Commons and offer it up. And what actually gained some traction was an amendment that Mill brought the following year to the Second Reform Bill, a very important bill that extended franchise and other rights to certain males, classes of males in England. And Mill attempted to replace the word man with person via an amendment to the Second Reform Bill in 1867. And later reflected actually that this was, quote, perhaps the only really important public service I performed in the capacity as a member of Parliament. So while his effort failed, he felt that it was very important. And so that would have obviously, by replacing man with person, would have granted women the same rights that they were granting men via the Reform Bill. Harriet Taylor Mill, unfortunately, passed away in 1859 of tuberculosis, so she was not around for any of his legislative efforts. However, she was around at the origins. She was, well, not the origins of the women's rights movement, but at early days of activism in the US and in England. So Harriet Mill, as I said, authored an essay in 1851 that was published the same year that, 2 years after Seneca Falls, of course, in the same year that the women in the United States held the second major national women's rights convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. So Harriet and Mill were close collaborators, and the extent to which they co-authored different texts and exchanged ideas that eventually made it into what Mill used to call a joint production of their own ideas, of their mutual ideas. The extent to which they each authored different essays can be a bit murky. And I can actually share an article that reviews the different perspectives on Harriet Taylor's actual contributions to Mill's work with people if they're interested in reading more about this. But they each tended to defer to one another. She would say he wrote an essay, and then he would say, oh no, she contributed significant portions. So it does get difficult to disentangle, but most scholars now believe that we can attribute the enfranchisement of women of 1851, that essay, to Harriet Taylor, and it was eventually published under her name. So what is clear is that she strengthened Mill's dedication to the cause of women's rights. It's hard to imagine that he would have been quite so stridently in favor and have later published The Subjection of Women without some of her influence. So she clearly shaped his thinking on the topic to an appreciable extent. So what is also clear is the extent to which both of these essays highly influenced the women's rights and the suffrage movement. Now, Subjection, as I may have mentioned, was published, The Subjection of Women, in 1869. And this expands upon and refines the concepts in the earlier essay. I'll get into briefly what they actually discuss, but the content of the two essays is very, very similar, even some of the language. But Harriet's work, even though it's shorter and it's not quite as well developed as Mill's essay, it is definitely worth looking at. Not only because she brings up a few different points with a different slant, but also because it was really there at the beginning. The New York Tribune later referred to Harriet's essay as the origin of the modern movement for women's rights in England, not in Michigan, but it was similarly in dialogue at the origin of, as I mentioned, the American women's rights movement. So at a critical point when it was struggling to gain credibility and momentum in the early 1850s, when they were first holding these women's rights convention. And we saw Jayne's cartoon about the bloomerism. I noticed that was dated to the same year of Harriet Mill's essay, 1851. So it was struggling to, you know, put forth a credible face to the topic, and that's why it was important that they had actually men with a lot of gravitas speaking on their behalf. And the American suffragists did actually note that having the association of their cause with such an eminent and respected thinker as John Stuart Mill lent an intellectual weight that wouldn't have been achieved otherwise. So, as I said, Harriet Mill's essays really in dialogue with these women's rights conventions in the United States. She learns about the one held in 1850, and she reprints some of the resolutions adopted and responds to them, reacts to them. And then in 1851, Wendell Phillips makes a speech at the second major women's rights convention in the US and explicitly references Harriet Taylor's essay and describes that essay as, or the concepts expressed in it as the source for the resolutions that they then adopted at that convention. And I think that this dialogue going back and forth is nicely captured in the Clements Library copy of The Enfranchisement of Women, which is bound up with Wendell Phillips' speech at that 1851 convention. It was published in Rochester, New York in 1858, that copy. And the Clements also holds a series of women's rights tracts that includes Harriet Taylor's essay with other speeches from Phillips, from Theodore Parker, and others. And the American suffragists did distribute The Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill, as well as Harriet Taylor's essay, The Enfranchisement of Women, at their conventions. They used to sell copies at their conventions and distribute them and refer to them constantly. And apparently Sarah Grimke, after The Subjection of Women was published in 1869, went door to door when she was 79 years old, distributing copies in her neighborhood because she considered the text to be so important. Paulina Wright Davis, who chaired the first Women's Rights Convention, said that The Enfranchisement of Women, Harriet's essay, successfully vindicated every position we assumed, reaffirmed and established the highest ground taken in principle or policy by our movement, and told upon the public mind both in Europe and this country. Later, we learned that it was from the pen of his, John Stuart Mill's, noble wife, to whom all honor for thus coming to the aid of a struggling cause. So the essays, just in brief, I mean, they're grounded in the Mill's philosophical foundation of utilitarianism and the basic human right to liberty and self-determination. But what they reason is that the equality of women and men is so essential to the continued social progress that opening up the entire world of economic and political options to women will improve social and moral conditions for everyone. So it's necessary for the elevation of society and the continued 19th century idea of progress. And in brief, what both essays, like I said, they share a lot of content, but what they both do is provide an analysis of the historical condition of women up to the contemporary state of women in society in the 19th century. Then they methodically refute the arguments that have historically been put forth against extending women the right to vote and other economic and social equality with men. And then they argue for the right of women to elect political leaders and hold public office, be educated in all subjects equally to men, claim an equal share of the improperty and inheritance in marriage. And both essays focus a lot on the institution of marriage as it was practiced in the 19th century, not only in terms of what it did to women's legal status, but also how it just affected women's daily lives, their physical life, their emotional life, their mental lives. Okay, that inequality in marriage, they argued, brought down both men and women to kind of the same level, especially once marriages started becoming more companionate in the 19th century. Mill said, in The Subjection of Women, Mill says, the time has now come when, unless women are raised to the level of men, men will be pulled down to theirs. Because he argued that women indirectly influence husbands' votes and political opinions, and that it was in the best interest of the polity to give women a better education and more opportunities so that they could inform themselves more fully on public issues and take an interest beyond in these issues beyond just how they affected their own immediate family. So it would be a less self-interested view of them. And the final thing where the essays differ a bit is in arguing that women should be able to pursue any occupation on equal terms as men. Now here, Mill wanted women to have that choice, but he believed that once they had a choice to make freely, if they chose to marry, they would probably choose to labor inside the home, educate the children, run the household, manage all the economy of the household. Whereas Harriet advocated for women to continue working outside the home, whether or not they were married or single women. And she says, well, let me find her quote because it's an important quote that's often quoted here. A woman, even under the present laws respecting the property of women, a woman who contributes materially to the support of the family cannot be treated in the same contemptuously tyrannical manner as one who, however she may toil as a domestic drudge, is a dependent on the man for subsistence. She also, I think it was Estrella who mentioned the discussion of women's sphere within the home. Another quote from The Enfranchisement of Women by Harriet Taylor is, "The proper sphere for all human beings is the largest and highest which they are able to attain to." That really reflects the moral philosophy of John Stuart Mill as well as Harriet Mill. So, so these were some small points in which the essays differ, but basically they were on the same page. And I also think it's interesting, I think this ties in a bit with some of the things Jayne mentioned as well, that the Mills, they really give a lot of discussion to domestic state of relationships between men and women and domestic violence. And the other kind of important body of work that Harriet Taylor's, that is attributed to Harriet Taylor more so than Mill, although they were joint productions, were these series of newspaper articles written in the 1840s and 50s that covered domestic cases of domestic violence in England, criminal cases, and then showed the lack of punishment of the men who perpetrated these crimes. And people at the time believed that domestic violence was on the wane, but no, they actually showed that far from that, it was not abating. It continued, and the legal system hadn't really caught up to that. So that's a bit of a tangent, but the point being that she was an engaged thinker, a critic of her social milieu, and that a lot of their, I would say, read both of these essays today, because things that they discuss are really relevant to us. We may think of that women are no longer subjected. Well, they talk about socialization even. If we open up the sphere of economic opportunity to women and educational opportunity, will they then actually pursue any education, any occupation? And they know that, you know, if women don't, it's because they are still being raised to think that there's only one type of education for women. Certain careers are not feminine. And I think we still see that today. I know there's been a push to get girls more involved in STEM and, you know, other careers that weren't traditionally considered feminine, or whatever the term you might want to use, or that maybe, you know, there's the idea that there's a natural female brain that doesn't work in a certain way. And these essays delve into that in a 19th century way, right? But they're very interesting. They say there's no way we can know what the true nature of a man or a woman is because everyone has been socialized in a certain way. So many relevant concepts, and of course, a heavy influence on the suffrage movements, both here and in England.
Thank you, Christina. I apologize to our attendees because we're running a little bit long today, and it's hard not to, though, because there are so many interesting things to talk about for all of these books and articles. But before we go, I do want to ask all of the panelists to reflect a little bit and to think about how the pandemic and the quarantine has changed how you've read these books and articles or how you're relating to this topic.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. You know, I think reading this from working from home with my young son is really kind of laying bare even more starkly than usual that stress between your private life as a wife and a mother and trying to maintain the household versus your public life, you know, whether that be trying to work or thinking about some of the calls for social reform. And I think we're really going to be seeing in the next couple of years as everything is laid bare for us, the pressing need for reforms to healthcare and you know, living wages that we're going to be seeing. The question for me is, when I feel so tapped out already, how do you then find that energy to call for social change, to get involved, to make a difference, to, you know, to acknowledge the problems that we're facing as a society and then go to that next step? How do you go above and beyond when you already feel stretched so thin? So reading the stories of suffragettes who were in that same situation, you know, 1920 is 2 years after the Spanish flu. You know, a lot of the women that wear highlights were also working women. They still had to earn a wage. They were raising families too, and that they still somehow find that energy and inspiration to go beyond what you might think your capacity is because they care so deeply about calling for change. And so in some ways, I see this really about a call to myself as well to think about my own limits. And to be mindful, you know, I think we're all under a lot of stress, and sometimes just staying in your pajamas for a day is called for, but also thinking about how we can go above and beyond and look to these women for a sense of inspiration and possibility, I think is really a beautiful way to try to connect to that moment in time as well.
I think for myself recently, I've been reflecting on voter turnout, especially now with the pandemic going on. Michigan already had their primary, but I do think, you know, right now, if the primary was today, would I want to go outside, even though there's, you know, really a quarantine? And so considering how in this book near the end, especially they talk about how women aren't turning out the way that they really hoped and wanted. And even today, voter turnout as a whole in the United States is not great for a whole host of reasons. So considering how, you know, those stresses today about voter turnout, they're not new. We are going to get through this, but you know, we are also living through a very deeply divided political time. And I do hear from even some of my classmates who are, you know, young and bright, and they're at U of M, and they're say, I'm not excited about the candidate this year. I don't think I'm going to vote. I will say people fought for the right to vote. You know, this is not about, to me at least, about whether they are your dream candidate, but about whether you want a voice at all in the story of our nation. And so I'm very passionate about voter turnout. And so I really liked how Elaine Weiss's book helped me get a better historical sense of this issue.
Christina, do you have any comments?
I've been thinking a lot about influence and just how this exchange of ideas, even in the 19th century, from one country to another across an ocean, and you know, when they lacked the ability to speak to people all over a nation or the world online, and yet they still managed to learn so much from one another, to carry on an intellectual exchange of ideas, to inspire one another, and to create movements that just even transcended the national boundaries, to elevate women everywhere. That, you know, I look back and admire how they did that without the modern forms of communication that we have. But I think about how, you know, we read these texts today and learn from their stories, and can be influenced and inspired by them, and that we need to take advantage of all of the things we have, all of the access to information that we have today, and the ability to share that information with one another, and so that we can inspire and inform our, you know, our colleagues and friends who are working towards the same ideals that we are.
Thank you. Okay, well, unfortunately, it's time to start wrapping up, but thank you all for sharing today. Before we go, I'm going to end our poll about Clements Tea Time. I'm excited to see that 16 people have participated in Clements Tea Time at some point. Coffee is barely winning against tea, and cookies are the standout choice for favorite treat. So I'm going to launch our final poll for today, asking people to help us shape the future episodes. Now, I want to point out that last week we asked people whether or not they were interested in being a panelist. And thank you so much for everyone who has already said that that's an interest of theirs. Just so you know, this week was spring break for my kids, so I did take a couple of days off to try to have a little bit of fun. So we haven't quite had a chance to follow up with everybody who said that they're interested, but that will happen soon. So hang in there and continue to let me know if that's something you're interested in. You can also email me at angmo@umich.edu with any feedback or any ideas that you have. And I'd like to invite our panelists to stay on and take a look at the Q&A section and the chat section. And just remember, if you're answering in the chat section, to send it to all panelists and attendees so that they see your answers. So everybody's welcome to continue chatting for a little while yet. And we will send a follow-up email with links to these various resources that we discussed and the titles that were discussed today, as well as a recording. Please tell all of your friends. We're going to continue to do this every Friday at 10 o'clock for at least a few more weeks. And we'd love to have more people join us. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. And